You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Hi, Jenni. Welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. Thank you for making time for us again.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
This is going to be a good one. I mean, I say that every time, but I mean it every time. But this is going to be a good one in the sense that we're talking about hypermobility, which is something that comes up a little bit in yoga circles, but maybe not as often as it should, given that many of the people listening are either likely to be hypermobile or to have hypermobile students. So since you created Yoga Medicine's Yoga for Hypermobility online course, I thought you'd be a really great place to start a conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I think a good starting point, like a good thing to disclose right off the bat, is that I personally am not hypermobile. So my sort of interest in this area is rooted in like kind of the academic and the research side of it, but also my experience working with hypermobile individuals. But that being said, I just wanted to make it clear that it's not something that I personally experience in my body. So I certainly can empathize with the challenges that come with being hypermobile. It's just something that I personally have been blessed with.
Yeah, I can attest to that. I've never seen her casually tuck her feet behind her head. So she's officially not in the hypermobile club, people. But in a sense, I think that can be really helpful because when it's something you experience yourself, it's almost like there are things that you take for granted. Whereas when you're looking at it from the outside and it's not something you experience yourself, you're kind of forced to go through the whole thought process logically, which means you're sometimes better at explaining things or expressing things that you don't feel in your own body from what you see on the outside. So I think it'll be helpful to have that perspective today, at least. So maybe we start by talking about being hypermobile is not just being flexible. It's not just, you're able to tuck both feet behind your head, as I said a minute ago. So maybe we start by talking about what is hypermobility and how does it differ from just being a flexible person?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really fantastic starting point for this conversation. And if you look up the definition of flexibility, well, first of all, the thing that becomes very obvious is that it's kind of a broad umbrella term that we use generally to describe the available range of motion that we have in the body. And the definition is also going to vary depending on which one you're looking at, like which body or authority or organization is giving their definition of it. But on the whole, we're referring to the available range of motion in the body. Most of these definitions also kind of focus on or revolve around the mobility or the flexibility of a joint or of the muscle tissue, like how extensible are the muscle tissues in terms of being able to lengthen in response to like tensile load or stretching. The thing that where it becomes interesting when it comes to hypermobility or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, EDS, is that we're actually not dealing either with the joint structure or the muscular tissue per se, but the thing that is at the crux of it is the connective tissue. And I meant to add here as well that, all these definitions referring to joints or muscles, as movement professionals and movement teachers or yogis or yoga teachers, we of course understand that there are a whole host of factors that contribute to range of motion or lack thereof, including all of our soft tissue and even nervous system variables. But when it comes to somebody who is hypermobile or even has EDS, the connective tissue is really at the crux of it, because what EDS is, it is an inherited connective tissue disorder, and it's the result of mutations in the genes that code for collagen synthesis. So in essence, when somebody has hypermobility or EDS, their body is producing collagen in a different way from what we would see in a non-hypermobile body. And the reason that this ends up being really significant is because collagen is one of the proteins, one of the things that makes up our connective tissue. And connective tissue is the stuff that makes up our ligaments and other things like our tendons as well.
Mm.
The ligaments is really kind of one of the main aspects to consider here, because ideally we want our ligaments to be very stiff, really durable structures that are super strong. Their job is to provide like a base level of stability and integration for our joints. So when the connective tissue, the collagen in our connective tissue is different, as it is in hypermobility or EDS, the ligaments actually lack those properties. They're not as well suited to providing that stability, the adequate stability for the joints. So that means that hypermobility can show up in a bunch of different ways. And the more obvious ones are these musculoskeletal symptoms. Like when you think of somebody who's super flexible, like you mentioned, putting both feet behind their head, popping into the splits really, really easily. So that above average range of motion is definitely like the typical thing that we think of first. Because of that laxity, that excess laxity, and the lack of stability in the joints, hypermobile people, depending on where they sit on the scale in terms of like being more or less hypermobile, they can be quite prone to joint dislocations and subluxations. That can be quite a common, like, reoccurring issue that they deal with. There can also be a lot more wear and tear on the joints themselves, just because the laxity and the lack of support from the ligaments, again, means that forces aren't being effectively dispersed through the joints. So there just ends up being like more mechanical wear and tear. That can also result in the excess movement in the joint, can also result in just soft tissue irritation. Like if you imagine a loose, floppy structure as opposed to a joint that's nicely like held in and integrated, the excess movement can potentially irritate the soft tissues around it, and there can be a lot of like tendinitis and things like that too. And ironically, hypermobile people also sometimes feel really, really tight, because the fact that the ligaments aren't providing that base layer of stability means that the muscles have to work overtime, and they end up in this kind of semi-contracted position all the time in an effort to provide some of that stability. So those are kind of the surface level obvious symptoms of hypermobility.
And I think that last one that you mentioned will for sure come up when we start to talk about yoga practice and yoga teaching, the sense that somebody might be coming into class going, oh, I feel so tight, I just need a really good stretch. And yet because of the laxity of the connective tissue and the greater range of motion that might be available to their joints, they might have to go to, way past what might be your end range to even feel like they're beginning to stretch those tissues. And that brings up one of the challenges to teaching or practicing yoga when you are on that spectrum. The other thing that really struck me from what you were talking about is the symptoms can be so varied in hypermobility disorders, because collagen is in so many places in our bodies. So you started by talking about the one that's the one that we think of first, that's the most obvious, that you can see from the outside, the changes in range of motion and potentially less intrinsic stability to the joints. But there are a bunch of other possible symptoms as well. Do you want to run through some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. And those can be the symptoms that are kind of happening on a more subtle level or under the hood a little bit more. So they're the ones that people often are dealing with in conjunction with having all this range of motion and maybe like joint pain and stuff as a result of that. But often it can be quite difficult to connect the two things, because, like you said, the constellation of symptoms can be so variable and so different. But you hit the nail on the head in saying that, collagen is found all through the body. So any system that it's in has the potential to be dysregulated or to malfunction as a result of that. We have connective tissue in our blood vessels and our digestive system and our nervous system. So one common symptom that comes with hypermobility is IBS or digestive issues, just because the structures of your digestive system do not have the same stiffness or like the springiness that we would want them to have. Difficulty regulating blood pressure is another common one. Same thing with the blood vessels not having the stiffness that allows the blood to be pumped effectively through the body. And actually, another common sort of co-symptom of hypermobility is orthostatic intolerance, which basically means that as you stand up, you are more prone to getting dizzy because the blood has, not been, it can't move effectively around your body and tends to pull in the lower extremities. Just anecdotally, hypermobile people also tend to really like sitting with their legs crossed because that kind of keeps the legs a little bit higher up so that the blood is not pooling in the lower extremity. Heart rate can be another one that's quite difficult, more challenging to regulate because of all these reasons. And connective tissue also has a proprioceptive role. So that means that it's constantly sending back signals to the nervous system about how the body is positioned in space and things like the levels of tension in our tissues. So often people with hypermobility also have quite poor body awareness because that whole proprioceptive input process is disrupted also. There's many aspects of hypermobility that are quite poorly researched, and this is probably one of them for sure. And often hypermobile people will also have had this thing since they were kids that they're thought of as being like very accident prone, or
Gumby.
Gumby. Yeah, exactly. And you can imagine that if you don't have good body awareness, then that would certainly make you potentially clumsier as well. And a big part of the more kind of subtle effects of hypermobility can be talked about under this umbrella of dysautonomia, which is basically a dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system. And this comes back to this idea of like the stuff that's supposed to be happening under the hood in your body without you really needing to like think about it or be aware of it. Like you and I are not sitting here actively aware of like our core temperature control being off, or our blood pressure or our heart rate being
Thank
somehow
goodness.
like out of
I'm
whack.
barely coping as it is. Imagine if
Yeah,
I
can
had
you
to be thinking
imagine
through
just
that checklist.
yeah, exactly. So it definitely adds to just like the stress in the system if the autonomic nervous system is poorly regulated as well, and that can kind of expand out into a whole nother constellation or host of symptoms as well, like anxiety and panic disorders, brain fog, poor sleep. And the unfortunate thing about this kind of aspect of it, aside from the complexity of it, is that you are dealing with a system like the body that is already under a lot of stress, whether it's emotional stress or the stress of feeling unstable or weak, or like there's something like off unsettling about like not being able to tell how your body is positioned in space. So all these things are kind of like adding to the stress load in the system. But then all of those inputs, it's just more negative input that contributes and piles on to the stress. So you can end up with this downward spiral of feeling kind of bad in your body during the day, having more anxiety. That makes you not sleep very well. So you're more tired the next day, which then predisposes you to having more pain and more anxiety. So it becomes this self-fulfilling loop of poor function. So unfortunately, hypermobile people can definitely be somewhat set up for nervous system overactivity, like sympathetic activation, and hypervigilance because of all these issues. And one
Which kind of
other,
makes sense if you think about, I'm living in this body that I can't quite trust. Things don't seem to work as easily for me as they do for the guy next to me. You can understand how that would make you a little bit more prone to anxiety or just not feeling safe in your own home.
yeah. And then when you combine that with, you've probably been to see a bunch of doctors and you haven't been able to get a diagnosis, or maybe you've even been like dismissed on some level and made to feel like you like it's in your head, or this isn't like something that's happening for reals. Yeah. So all of that can kind of pile on to the stress. And one thing that I think is extra, I'm saying interesting in air quotes because I don't mean to like undermine how challenging this would be, but when the autonomic functions are poorly regulated, that being a stressor can also create a situation where your levels of adrenaline are elevated. So it's just like more stress, basically. And ironically, that can actually, quote unquote, help in the short run because adrenaline is a vasoconstrictor. So it kind of feels good because your blood pressure is a little bit more in check for once. But of course, having chronically elevated levels of adrenaline is not a desirable or by any means sustainable scenario to be in the long run. And ultimately, that's just going to contribute to like decreased quality of sleep and more anxiety and all of these other things that you're already dealing with. So one of the big things, which we'll talk about more later, I'm sure, is trying to kind of tamp down and control some of that sympathetic activation, so that we can kind of talk the nervous system off the ledge a little bit and just create a slightly more stable foundation from which to start working on these other things.
Yeah, I feel like you're painting a super depressing picture here of, every possible collagen-related scenario that could go wrong. And I imagine that there are people listening as I am going, yes, that's me. Yes, that's me. Oh, that not so much. That not so much. So the sort of grab bag of symptoms can vary quite markedly between different individuals that both have Ehlers-Danlos or are on the hypermobility disorder spectrum. How common is it in the general population?
So again, this is not a very well researched area, and exactly as you said, partly because of the wide range
Mm,
of symptoms and how the severity of the
yeah,
symptoms. There's probably a bunch of hypermobile people out there who don't even know that they're hypermobile because they are just like pretty
high
functional.
functioning. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's at about 20% of the general population is thought to be
Oh,
hypermobile
wow.
to some
And
degree.
yeah, and that really leads me to think, why is it so important to have that conversation in the yoga world? Because I'm sure that in the yoga world, more than 20% of students are somewhere on that spectrum.
Totally. Yeah, I think your instincts are completely right on that front. We say 20% in the general population, but I would argue that in a yoga class, that percentage, like there's likely to be more than 2 out of 10 students who are potentially somewhere on that spectrum.
Mm,
Um, I think people that are very bendy and very flexible naturally tend to self select for movement modalities like yoga and dance and gymnastics. I mean, it's perfectly logical and makes complete sense. Like, why would you not choose a movement modality where your
that you're
range of
good
motion
at.
is actually an asset and something that you can be like rewarded for? So they can really excel at these styles of movement. But of course, if you can imagine the using and going into those ranges of motion routinely or even as a matter of default, that does come at a cost. And most, like, not that I'm assuming every high level gymnast is hypermobile or has EDS, but their careers tend to be quite short. And same with acrobats and all those kinds
Mm.
of people, like contortionists. Like, your body just really can't handle visiting or living in those ranges of motion on a regular basis.
Yeah,
So
and I think when I hear you talk about the symptoms, both physical and more sort of nervous system psychological, the prevalence of this disorder in the yoga world makes perfect sense to me. Because firstly, if you're somebody who's been a Gumby for your entire childhood and maybe you're not great at the kinds of sports that your friends are good at, and then you go to an activity where high range of motion is rewarded and prized and
mhm,
reflected everywhere that you look, and there's that element of nervous system downregulation, of finishing, feeling really at home in your body and really calm and really present. You
yeah.
can see why yoga would be like the perfect antidote in some ways, but also the perfect storm if you lean into that range of motion too much. So that's why I think it's so important for us to be having this conversation, whether you're somebody teaching students that you're looking around at and wondering if they need a little bit more of that structure and stability, or whether you're one of those folks yourself.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of different ways that yoga can be really helpful for hypermobile people, and you've just highlighted like the main ones really. And Another thing that can be, and we can discuss like how yoga can be super helpful for hypermobile bodies in more detail, but another thing that I'll just mention here is that slower, more controlled movement can be really great as well, because it's giving you the opportunity and the time to really feel into your body and how you're transitioning between these shapes. So it's kind of there's like built-in proprioceptive
Mm.
awareness boosting in a yoga practice. Some of these smaller, deeper movements can be really useful as well, because we're activating some of the deeper stabilizing muscles of the body, which,
Mm.
we really want to make sure that those guys are working as well as possible to provide at least some of that stability for the joints. And those muscles also have a proprioceptive role. So when we can get more in touch with the details of how our body is positioned in space and how our joints are positioned, then all of that is going to contribute to like positive input for the nervous system, which really all your nervous system wants to know is that everything's good
Are we
in the
good?
body. So if it can sense that like, oh, we have some control, we have some stability in these joints, then that's going to feel good on this really basic level. That also, we know from research that poor body awareness is definitely correlated with worse pain outcomes.
Mm.
So that's a really simple way that we can kill a bunch of birds with one stone, is just some of this small controlled movement that's going to tap into all of these. It's going to check all of these boxes that we just mentioned.
Yeah, I'm not up for killing birds, but I'm definitely up for multiple boxes ticked by one activity. So maybe we set yoga aside for one moment and we talk about what can be helpful for people with hypermobility. And the first thing you mentioned was slower, more controlled movements. And that makes so much sense to me, because if you imagine your regular person with normal collagen synthesis having a superhighway of connection to information about how their joints are positioned in space, somebody who doesn't get that feedback from the collagen right at base level, it's a much narrower track. It's like a tiny little kind of footpath with grass and weeds growing through it. But the more they walk that path and the more familiar it becomes, the quicker the transmission is going to be, the more efficiently they're going to be able to walk that path, because they've walked it a million times. They've connected to their feet and ankles. They've connected to their hips and their core and their spine. They've connected to their shoulders and their neck and their breathing and their belly. And you can start to see how reinforcing those pathways will just make them more and more efficient over time. So on top of slower, more controlled movements, what else can be helpful?
Yeah, so the slow controlled movement is really helpful. I think we kind of mentioned this briefly earlier on in the conversation, but this is going to be especially, it's basically helpful for everybody, but it's going to be crucial for those who are like lower on the function scale. But starting with that nervous system down regulation
Mm.
is going to be crucial, just to kind of ramp down a little bit from that state of hypervigilance. So if you have a hypermobile client, it's not unreasonable to assume that they're going to be walking into your class or your one-on-one session with some degree of sympathetic arousal. So
Hmm.
just talking them down from that, because that's the state that often they end up living in for
Mm.
these varieties of factors. So just talking them back a little bit from that, that's not a good place from which to initiate movement or in which to feel safe or comfortable. So if we can reduce that effect a little bit, just that hypervigilance and that
Mm.
super alert place, then that's going to be really, really helpful. Not to mention that if their nervous system is a little bit calmer, they're actually going to sleep better as well, which is going to allow them to recover better from any physical stimulus or strengthening stimulus
Mm.
that you're doing. So all of that is going to be a positive contributor to breaking that cycle of like feeling like garbage during the day, sleeping badly, then feeling like garbage, but also being tired the next day. So you're kind of
Mm.
nipping in the bud that self-feeding cycle of
Mm.
dysfunction.
That makes sense
Um,
to me. So starting with something that, maybe not straight into stillness and, slow breathing, but heading in that direction of just
yeah,
slowing everything down, slowing the cycle. And I presume finishing that way as well, so that the last note that you leave the taste buds with is nervous system, we're good.
yeah.
Everything's fine here. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And even just simple breath awareness is really helpful.
Mm.
You don't have to get complicated or fancy with breathing techniques or anything like that. And in fact, if it's too complicated and you're just giving them another thing that they need to try to manage, or retention based breath practices, those might not be the best for somebody who's already prone to like anxiety or something like that. So you can keep it super simple and just encouraging, breath awareness. Belly breathing, this is another thing that is quite common in hypermobile bodies, especially those that have gravitated towards dance or gymnastics. Those people absolutely can end up in a situation where they're kind of living in a position of spinal extension and like a rib flare. So
it's my happy place.
oh, you love that. Okay.
I love a rib pop. That's great.
But the thing is that you can probably get out of the rib pop and come back to, you have some awareness around what it's like to come out of that and into a more neutral position. Because the thing about that rib flare is that it does tend to keep the breath like higher up in the chest. It's not a mechanically optimal place from which to initiate like deep diaphragmatic breathing. So you might just be inadvertently kind of maintaining some of that nervous system hyperactivity. So just practicing like flexion patterns, it can be either passive or active, but giving that individual an opportunity to feel like a different position in their spine, like that flex position, and how it potentially lets them access that deeper breath, is going to be really helpful. And just like a moderate range of motion as well. So it doesn't have to be something deep or intense, but just experience a moderate range of motion is super helpful. And as a side note, that can also be the kind of thing where if you are living in that rib pop, just moving the rib cage back and onto the shoulder blades is going to put the muscles of your upper back in a more optimal position from which to fire, as opposed to when they're kind of like floating off of the back ribs, if you are like really flaring or popping. So that's like a cascade of positive benefit as well, because as soon as we can get these upper back and scapular stabilizing muscles a little bit more online, we now have better shoulder function too. And the shoulders are one of the most common areas of irritation and subluxation. So there's so many things that you can do with just putting somebody like in a slightly supported shavasana with the legs a little bit lifted, maybe a little bit of a chin tuck, and then suddenly they're able to breathe into their belly, feel this whole new shape in their body that they're not used to inhabiting. And then there's just like that cascade of benefits from that.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful and simple place to start. I love the fact that you've highlighted it doesn't have to be super complicated, because I know myself, when we get into 4, 7, 8 counts, it's all too much to think about. It's all too much to think about. And really, you're not saying a rib pop is always awful. You're saying you want to have options in your body. Nothing is awful, but everything is awful if you have to do it all the time. So, and I imagine that can be quite challenging, because I remember when I first started creating muscular stability in my body, it was all or nothing. So I either had my abs on and I was kind of scooped and hollowed, or they were completely off and my ribs were popped, and there was really no place in between. And that's taken quite a while for me to find my way to. Now, you moved on to talk about getting a little more familiar with moderate range of motion. I know from people I've worked with who are much more hypermobile than I am, that can be a supremely uninteresting place for somebody who's hypermobile. Like, I want to feel something, which means I've got to have my stomach on the floor. I'm not going to be propping myself up on my arms in a forward fold, because I'm not feeling anything there. I'm wasting time. What do you do to counter that sort of moderate range of motion is boring complaint?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're totally right that hypermobile people tend to want to hang out in these deep stretches, in these deep ranges of motion, because the lack of tension in the system means that they don't feel anything until they get to that end range. And then it's like scratching an itch, right? Like you feel all unstable and weird in your body. And then suddenly you get to a place where you actually feel something, and it feels good temporarily, but of course, ultimately that's not going to be helpful. So one of the things that is really helpful is breaking that end range habit, or at least the tendency to automatically just slam into end range. Just educating people about this is going to be super helpful, because, or having them understand what the benefits are, because like you said, it's going to feel like a very, not just boring, but difficult place to inhabit, that mid-range,
Mm,
because it's so alien. But ultimately, that mid-range is a really good place from which to start building a little bit more strength
yeah.
and support and stability for the joints. That's where we're most easily able to access muscular strength. And isometrics are fantastic as well, because often these are muscles that haven't been used actively for in a particular way for a long time potentially. So doing isometric contractions, just holding steady, is a really accessible entry point. It also
Mm,
reinforces that neuromuscular connection and really can help develop this feeling of connection and competence and trust in your body, all of which again is like a positive input into the
mm.
nervous system. And building strength in the mid-range, it's going to feel alien and weird potentially to begin with, but that strength obviously is not just limited to that one spot. Like, it does translate to other ranges as well.
Mm,
So the starting point would be the mid-range, but then ultimately you move a little bit away from there, a little bit further, a little bit further. You learn to engage in all of these different spots until you actually have a range of motion that you can actively control, which is
yeah.
exactly what we want. But
Yeah. I think that's
I
really important
totally,
to say. Like, the end range is not going to be off the table for the entire rest of your life.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Treat this as a
Yeah.
sort
And
of
I'll,
recalibration of your taste buds to more subtle flavors, and trust that as you can control your range of motion, you'll regain your end range again.
yeah, absolutely. And just kind of reframing the whole thing as it doesn't, it's stretching or range of motion is not the end all be all. Like, there's other aspects of your functionality that you're going to be able to access. And I totally understand that this is like this can be a big mental transition for a hypermobile person, because for better or worse, this is something that is part of their identity. It's part of who they are.
Mm,
Maybe they've been rewarded or like praised for their range of motion. I'll never forget one client that we had recently at my company. We work with quite a few hypermobile clients, and this is a woman who was very much on the less functional end of the scale. She actually was not able to work because she was in so much discomfort and so much pain. She had all of these other symptoms that, like, basically, if you had a checklist of like bad stuff that can happen with hypermobility, she would have checked all those boxes. And she had put in quite a bit of work to see specialists and doctors and do a ton of research on her own. So she was very like up to speed on everything, and was kind of at the end of her rope by the time that she came to us, just because she hadn't really been able to get the help that she needed. So we talked with her for, I want to say, almost an hour and a half on her intake, and like explained to her what we were going to do, like what our approach would be. She's in all this pain and all this discomfort. Her daily life is like not good because of how bad she feels in her body. And she was really pleased that we were going to be able to like work with her and actually understood what she was experiencing. All that being said, at the end of those 90 minutes, her main concern, the burning question that was left in her mind was, will I still have my range of motion by the time that I'm done with my program? Like, she was so attached to her flexibility. There was often this like mental disconnect where rationally, you can feel that your body like is
yeah.
not working well. But at the same time, there's still this attachment to the range of motion, and you're trying to keep it, even though you know that it's not good. Like, it's not good for you.
I actually really get that. I mean, as somebody who grew up with zero hand-eye coordination and, no ball handling skills whatsoever, and, no concept of distance and space, um, having something that you're good at, even if it's just popping out the splits at a party, it's nice to be good at something physical, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess what I was going to say there was, having been the student in yin and having taught the student in yin who's always like, I'm not feeling it. What else could I do? How much further can I go? Can you put weights on me? Can you lean on me? Group classes, I don't think, are the best place to have that conversation because, someone's not coming to you with a problem that they're seeking to have resolved. So you might plant seeds, but you're probably not going to change the mind of the student in yin who is, stomach flat to the floor with their forward folds. When you have a one-on-one scenario where somebody's coming to you with something that they're hoping to have resolved, there's a lot more space to have that conversation. And maybe it won't happen in the first session. Maybe it's like, yes, you will have your range of motion back, but for right now, I want you to try something different
Yeah.
because what you have been trying hasn't been working. So let's back up. Let's try something different. Give me 3 months, see how it feels, and then we'll expand from there. You've got more fertile grounds for there to be some level of compliance to the suggestions that you're making. And at the end of the day, if they want their range of motion and they're willing to have pain, their body, their experience, totally their call. But it's not a great conversation to have in a group setting. You're probably just likely to lose that student from your yin class because you're not letting them have any fun whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other limitation of group classes, which I totally agree, that's not an ideal setting for hypermobile students or for you to try to have that conversation, because it's often a much more prolonged process that in some instances they actually need some like support through, other than just you giving them exercises. Like it's
Mm,
definitely like a mental adjustment. But the other thing about group classes is that most of the people, like if you look at a general population hatha vinyasa yoga class,
mm,
most people there are there because they want to increase their range of motion, because they feel stiff and tight and they want to be
mhm,
more flexible. So for better or worse, there's obviously going to be a tendency to also instruct the class in a way that resonates with most of the people there, to try,
mhm,
like you're doing the best that you can in a group setting and trying to like kind of cover all the bases, except it's not possible to do that anyway. So we have to remember that most people are there to actually stretch.
mm,
So you're going to be a little bit limited, or quite a lot limited in terms of what you can do with hypermobile students in
mm.
that setting. But that one-on-one setting is absolutely fantastic for that, because you can dive in a little bit more. You mentioned earlier about hypermobile bodies like needing to have options, movement options, in terms
Yeah.
of getting out of the postural tendencies and the habits that they're in. So that's such a good way to think about it too, because a lot of the time with hypermobile individuals and bodies, the problem is that they actually have too many options, like to begin with. So if you see
Mm,
a hypermobile person moving, then especially like hips, ankles, wrists, all of that, shoulders,
mm.
there is like a crazy amount of movement available in those joints that they can't control. So we are actually trying to make them more stiff and reduce their range of motion. But you do need a pretty creative approach sometimes, because you actually need to limit the amount of movement, or the amount of movement options available to them, in order for them to be able to connect with the muscular action
Yeah.
that you're looking for. So
And you can
even just
understand how if you've got a million options, your nervous system's going to give you here's your default. We're not going to go through those million options every single time. So here's your default, ribs pop out. Great, tick. There's
yeah.
that taken care of for now. So yeah, that does make sense to me. You want to give them options in the long term, but that might mean fewer options in the short term.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And whatever helps to actually help them connect with the thing that you're looking for, whether it's like your glutes engaging without your hips like swaying side to side like
Mm.
crazy. So that's where the a lot of props and using the wall and other like tactile feedback can be really helpful,
Yes,
where
yes.
you're just
Even
like
palpating with
limiting.
your own hands
Yeah,
is that thing
exactly.
firing? Yes, yes, that thing's firing. Okay, that's how
Yeah,
it feels when that thing fires. Yeah, I love that. So squeezing things, pushing against things, palpating tissues that are working. That's
yeah,
all so helpful. Resisting out against a strap or resisting against a resistance band,
absolutely.
something that gives you some external input.
Or fixing other parts of your body in place so that they can't move while you're focusing on the thing that you actually are trying to work on. One awesome example that I saw on Instagram recently was from somebody who specializes in strength training for hypermobile bodies, and she was talking about the fact that something as simple as like an overhead press is really helpful to build like shoulder strength and all that kind of stuff. But if you're having a very hypermobile person try to do that movement in a standing position, think of all the areas underneath the actual target area that are potentially like wobbling around. It could potentially be really difficult to execute what for some of us might be a much more simple movement, just because there's so much instability like in the foundation. So just having that person like sit on a chair, suddenly we've taken the lower body out of the equation. We don't have to worry about that anymore. Maybe you have them do like a wall sit. So now lower body is out of the way. We don't have to think about that. And yeah, nobody wants to
This
do a
sounds
wall sit. But in this
shoulder press in a wall sit. Oh my God. No, I'm going to do it this
but then
afternoon
think
and I'll
about it,
report
then
back.
your whole upper body is actually in place as well. And maybe you even have them hold like one dumbbell so that there's not two things moving. So there's all these different ways to get creative and kind of limit the movement options, of which there are too many for most people
I love that.
actually
And then
live
that
in
obviously
hypermobile bodies.
presents some progressions that you can then make as you regain a little bit more neuromuscular control. So we haven't said it out loud. We've talked around it in quite a few different ways. Strength training is obviously key for people who are hypermobile, and not just slinging around 400 pounds, but starting with quite isolated joint stability and then adding load progressively. And you mentioned starting in that pretty safe mid-range, starting potentially with isometrics where you're really highlighting positional control, and you're less likely to be sore the next day compared to working eccentrically, for example. Yeah, I think these are all really helpful tips for people who are like, great, where do I start? Strength and stability.
Yeah, and it goes without saying, or maybe it doesn't, so I'll just say it, but we do need to have a baseline of functionality before it becomes productive or safe or helpful to add on external load. So, if somebody's still like really, really wobbly, we want to get them to a place where they can like feel some tension, and then it's going to be, they can maintain form, and then it's going to actually be helpful to add on some repetition and some load. But there's a lot of research that very much supports the notion that strength training for hypermobile people is fantastic. But just the same as with any other individual, you would want to progress them safely and start them, like meet them where they're at. So you can start with something that's safe and appropriate for them. Hypermobile bodies can also be quite prone to flare-ups. So you want to be mindful of the fact that their exercise tolerance is often quite low. So you need to be like patient and adaptable with your plan. Sometimes there's going to be some trial and error involved in like, okay, that was too much. I actually can't do anything for a few days now. So you're going to have to like scale it back a little bit. Some days are definitely going to be better and some days are going to be worse, but you're just going with the flow and seeing what works. I will sometimes reframe flare-ups as kind of a positive thing, if that's
well, it's
possible.
input, isn't it? You're getting some information from the system.
It's input, and for somebody with EDS or hypermobility, you can use the flare-up as a progress marker. If you're able to reduce the frequency, severity, or duration of your flare-ups, then you're progressing in the right direction. And I've absolutely done this with my clients as well, where one recent client that I had is actually like an elite youth hockey player, and he was dislocating his shoulders all the time. And in the 3 months that I worked with him, he dislocated both of his shoulders again, but in both instances, he recovered much more quickly and was able to get back to playing a lot more quickly as well. So it was kind of a minor setback or a little blip on the radar, but from his perspective, he still got what he wanted out of it because he was able to like return back to his sport more quickly. And he regained a lot of confidence also in knowing that there's stuff that I can do.
Yes.
When this happened, it's not just like, oh, I just have to
here I go again. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. So we've talked about a bunch of things already, from starting and finishing with some level of nervous system down regulation. We've talked about kind of recalibrating your settings, at least for a time, to go out of your end range and more towards your mid range, and to be willing to sit with whether it's boredom or discomfort or awkwardness or lack of familiarity there, just to spend time there. to help you kind of reduce the millions of options and to start introducing positional options again more slowly. We talked about the power of having tactile external feedback, whether that's a block or a wall or something to push against or something to keep the rest of your body still. So you're isolating movement to one joint. We talked about the importance of gradual progressive strength training. And it sounds like ideally you'd be working with somebody who can guide you through that process.
Yeah,
So that you,
absolutely.
yeah. Anything else that's generally helpful? Is that enough to create a feeling of I'm safer in my body now, so I'm less anxious, so I'm sleeping better? Is that enough to kind of address those more psychological symptoms? Or is there something else that you'd recommend?
So I would say it's going to be so highly dependent on the individual. So
Why
I
does
think
everybody say that on this podcast? Why is there never just an easy answer?
there's never just like oh, here's your simple
Here's the
solution.
way.
Like here you
Yeah.
go. Yeah, exactly. Um, so I would just consider the work that if you are working with hypermobile students, like think of the menu of options that you have within like
Hmm.
your skill set and your scope of practice that you can offer to them. I'm not a nutritionist, but I know that there's a lot of stuff that you can do on the nutrition front that's going to help you to feel better as well. Um, Nikki Knob Levy is a really great resource for this, and one
We'll
of the
link
things
to
that
that in the
she
show
was
notes.
yeah, she's fantastic. And just like a random factoid of hers that I remember is that if you are able to take electrolytes at the same time every day and like increase your salt intake, for example, these are all things that can help to regulate your blood pressure. So
Hmm.
I I hope nobody quotes me on any of that stuff because I'm that's not my area of
Asterisk,
expertise at all.
not a nutritional professional. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So the point is that there are people out there who specialize in working with hypermobile bodies on the nutrition and the strength training front.
Mm.
And in the meantime, if you are able to, if you need to get back to that like base level of functionality before like external load becomes is even on the menu of options, there are PTs who specialize in working with EDS. A bunch of them have digital programs as well, or they do like online work too. And I can add the information for those people on the show notes as well. So there's
Great.
definitely resources out there, and I feel like there's more awareness around EDS,
I
and
agree.
the EDS communities are really powerful as well. By the time that most people are seeking out actual EDS informed professionals to work with, they already have quite a lot of knowledge themselves about what's happening in their bodies. And if they don't, they're going to be super relieved that you can explain to them what's happening in their bodies and that there's like things that you can do, because EDS is incredibly complicated and it can show up in all these different ways.
Mm.
One of the like unfortunate common threads with hypermobile people is that they have often spent many years in the medical system without being able to get a diagnosis or appropriate help. So the thing is that if you know what you're looking for and what you have your menu of options in terms of like what you can offer them, they're going to be so receptive and so grateful to get that information,
Mm.
whether or not they already have done the research themselves. Like they might know everything there is about EDS, but they don't know how to apply that in a movement setting or in that nervous system downregulation setting to help them feel better. So you're
Mm.
bringing like practical skills and or knowledge, which is, I would say, in most instances, going to be very gratefully received. And then in the areas where you don't have expertise, you can refer out to
Refer out.
somebody who
Yeah.
does. Yeah.
I love that. So circling back to the yoga setting, starting and finishing with nervous system downregulation, tick. That's kind of how we roll. What else would you suggest for someone who's working with a yoga student who is hypermobile?
Yeah. So again, it's just breaking that end range habit. And I'm not of the mind that we need to like ban end range exactly like you said, because it's potentially something that's really comfortable and familiar for that person. So maybe
Mm.
it can be a nervous system downregulation tool if they occasionally want to go into a deep stretch. But outside of that, we want to familiarize them with these more moderate ranges of motion, familiarize them with what it feels like to engage and create muscular support in those more moderate ranges of motion.
Mm.
Um, I love teaching isometrics, but with the notion of actually like really deliberately co-contracting around a joint, because that
Mm,
can be quite challenging and novel and also super rewarding and confidence building, to actually feel like, oh, my shoulder is plugged into its socket when I do these two actions.
mm,
So all of that can be super helpful. And if you're teaching a public yoga class, just remembering too that, there's different ways to cue movements and to cue shapes, and we can utilize words that emphasize feelings of support and stability rather than specifying like joint positions or joint angles, or constantly talking about and I'm not saying this to like disparage stretching. Like I think all of that is fantastic too, but we don't have to exclusively talk about like releasing tension or creating length or that kind of thing.
mm.
Even your average person really benefits. Your non-hypermobile person really benefits from stretching in a moderate range of motion. Like they don't need to push into something crazy either, and
Mm.
they really benefit from basic stability work as well. Like,
And in fact, releasing tension is a phrase that I actually use and I have benefited from, because my perception of a stretch is a pretty intense sensation where, if I'm in a forward fold, my stomach is on the floor, my head's on the floor, my pubic bone's on the floor. Releasing tension as opposed to
how?
feeling a stretch. Yeah, well, if you take your legs a little bit apart, there's room there. But for me, recalibrating to, you're probably not going to feel a stretch here, at least not an intense stretch. Be okay with that and see if you can imagine the muscles just releasing a bit of tension, softening, or, softening their grip. That, for me, that language can be part of that kind of repatterning of, oh, that's not the sensation I'm looking for. I'm not looking for that
Mhm.
really strong directional pull. I'm just looking to feel like the muscle is getting a little bit kind of softer and more giving. And
Yeah.
to me, that was really helpful language. So yet again, individual results may vary, but not defining a pose by how it's supposed to look from the outside, and creating more interest around exploration and curiosity, and maybe less intense sensations to give us room for that
Mhm.
curiosity. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think a lot of hypermobile people, both on the less functional end of the scale as well as the highly functional end of the scale, are going to be really receptive to just having the challenge reframed for them, because they're used to the challenge just being like, how much more range of motion can I get? How much deeper can I go into this stretch? So it's kind of on us as the teacher to flip the script a little bit and just give them a
Mm,
different challenge, because they have that mindset that they can apply in any way that they want to. So maybe we can somehow reframe things in such a way that they're able to channel those energies in a way that's ultimately more productive and more beneficial for them. And that might look very different from your very hypermobile client who is like super attached to their range of motion
mm,
versus your more athletic client who actually is very used to like receiving coaching and instruction and can take that really really well. If they're very athletic, hypermobility probably for them is a nuisance that they are like very happy to get rid of. So
mm,
they're going to be potentially a little bit easier to work with in that setting.
mm,
But it's just about figuring out what their goal is, like where they're trying to get to, and then making the stuff that you're giving them feel relevant to that goal. So just
mm,
reminding the very hypermobile person that, like, remember you started working with me because you want to have less joint pain and you don't want to be stiff in your body and you want to be less anxious, like all
mm.
these things. So just kind of reframing back
Remember
around to
why you came
rehone.
here.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly.
Yeah,
You
I
can
think
stretch
that's,
when you get home, but that's not
yeah.
what this is right now.
Yeah. And I think also the impermanence of for right now is really powerful. Like, just for right now, let's try this different approach, knowing that we're going to expand from that approach as time goes on. And I think anyone's had an experience of being in a situation where they're very triggered and they might have to remove that trigger entirely and down regulate the whole system. And then when the system is more resilient, you can reintroduce that trigger and it doesn't have anywhere near the same effect. So there's always
Exactly.
space for things to change down the track. I think that's
Yeah.
great. You've shared a lot of really helpful advice. Um, both from the perspective of the individual, people listening can take this advice away for themselves, and also for somebody teaching individuals. I say again, teaching groups, other than planting seeds, you're not going to be able to change people's behavior patterns massively. So plant seeds, talk about, creating stability and structure and softening and releasing and relaxing. And maybe none of your students need to be in extreme range, but don't expect much to change in a group setting, perhaps. So we've talked a little about resources already, other than your online course on yoga medicine, which we'll link to for teachers. It's got 4 continuing education units. What other resources would you direct people to who want to know more?
Yeah, so Nikki Nablibi, I think, is wonderful from a strength training and nutrition perspective. Catherine Cowie, who also specializes in strength training for hypermobile people, she's on Instagram and has a website as well. And her and Jill Zimmerman, who is a physical therapist, actually just did a really great webinar on strength training for hypermobile bodies that I am pretty sure is still available if you want to sign up for that. And then just here locally, here in Durham, where I live, we have a PT who is actually kind of like an expert in this region of the country. His name is Joel Cabrera, and his practice is Myo Durham. And he has a recently launched digital program for hypermobile people. And this is for people who do need to get to that baseline level of functionality before they can start to move in more intense or externally loaded ways. So he's a great resource as well.
Great. We'll link to all of those. And I know that you also have a class on yoga medicine online, which is specifically for flexible folks, balanced function for flexible folks. It's a class series. So we'll link to that too if you're looking for somewhere to kind of start, to dip your toe in. And if you're looking for those much more kind of specific resources, we'll link to those folks in our show notes. And last question, as always, is where would you direct people who want to connect with you?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I'm on Instagram. It's just my first name and last name at jennitarma.com. And I work through my company, Kari Prehab. Rachel, you're very kindly wearing our hoodie right now as well.
It's so soft. It's so soft.
Yeah, so you can go to our website, kariprehab.com, or our Instagram feed, where we're posting all kinds of tips and wellness and different movement stuff all of the time. And our newsletter is really active as well. We're always sending out free sample programs and all kinds of other stuff as well. So you can find all of those links on our Instagram too.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing all this really helpful information with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun, as per usual.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.